for people who don't know, for our audience, what is ableism?
Yeah, well, the really short Oxford English Dictionary definition of it is discrimination against disabled people, um, which might feel familiar to people based on their understanding of racism or sexism. I tend to think that it's a little bit more elaborate and sprawling than that. I think because I think when you hear that definition, you think of individual acts of discrimination, and then all someone has to do is think about how they don't do that, and then they have nothing to do with ableism, right? Like if I don't discriminate against disabled people when I see them, then um like as if ableism only has to be like the school bully who's like picking on the kid in the wheelchair, and that of course would be one example, but it's a lot more pervasive and common than that. So ableism uh in my mind has much more to do with um structuring the whole world around a largely imagined, idealized body. So the ways that we structure our physical spaces, to the ways that we shape our classrooms, to the ways that we make our laws, and thinking about who do we have in mind when we build and create and design. And more often than not, it's this imagined, idealized body that is thin and has endless abilities and doesn't have any particular needs and never ages. And right, that's the body that often we design with in mind. And ableism, um, or I guess I would say, in order to move beyond ableism, or I don't know, resist ableism, we think outside of that, and we think about all of the ways that our bodies are different and have different needs, and process differently and move differently, and perceive differently, age
Age differently.
differently. Yeah, yeah. And that's the model that we should be designing with in mind. So yeah, that's my more elaborate definition of ableism.
I like that. It makes a lot of sense. And I think that's tied into a whole bunch of other things like universal design and
Hmm.
accessibility in more
Hmm.
spaces and being
Hmm.
able to participate in the world in,
Yeah.
you know, in better ways. But uh, I I like the way, where does language play a part in that?
Yeah, so I was going to say, I think it's really easy for us to imagine the ways that that works for physical design, right? Like from buildings to like tools and technology, but it does apply to so much more than that. And like I'm even thinking about how ableism would show up in something like online dating, or just dating in general. Doesn't have to be online dating. I just Online dating seems to be the way people date nowadays. But so if you even think about how ableism would show up in something like dating, um, we would go back to that idea of who's the center of what we imagine for that. So if you imagine that the only partner that you could be with, or the only viable partner in a romance, or that you would go on a date with, would be someone who looks and perceives and processes in this very particular way, that would be an example of ableism, right? Being unable to imagine or accept a romance that with a person that um, maybe is in a wheelchair, or maybe has a limb difference, or maybe has autism, or hearing impairment, or whatever it is, right? And so often when we think about how romance is depicted to us in the stories told around us, how often is disability included in that? Like really? Um, so language. Your question was about language. How does that show up in language? Um, are you thinking of things like language, like lame? He was so blind to the truth, like phrases like that. Is that what
Yeah,
you were
yeah,
thinking of?
and right, things like
Yeah.
that where I've been reading up on it. This was like a new concept for me too,
Hmm.
and I think a lot of it is valid on the linguistic side. I
Hmm.
just worried that sometimes it goes too far. Like when you're doing something, you're a writer, so when
Hmm.
you're describing something in a piece of literature, a show, a book,
Hmm.
like
Hmm.
are you cognizant of like you can't use or you shouldn't use
Mhm.
the word blind in that way, even if that expression is something that you want that character to say?
Yeah, it's interesting. Yeah, I am mindful of it. I am thinking about it when I pull words together for a sentence. I think yeah, like you can go online and find whole lists of ableist terms that you're not supposed to use. And the two I named are a couple of them. Lame is a really common one. Um, that actually I sometimes forget when I'm just talking to people, and I sometimes do use that sometimes. But to me, I think with language, I think that the terms that you would find on a list like that, like blinded by the truth, or paralyzed in fear, um, or lame, or dumb, I think the way we've come to use those terms is really only evidence of ableism. It's really only, to me, I see that as like a side effect or a symptom of ableism, is something that sort of would like bubble to the surface, um, because the roots are so deep in that sort of, or maybe a better metaphor would be like the roots of that are so deep, and then you have kind of the leaves that sprout off of that, all the way down the road. And so to me, if you want to fix ableism, I think trying to like trim the leaves on the edge of the tree is, seems like a really what's the word, inefficient, like a little bit of an inefficient way to go about it. You can continue to prune and prune and prune, and try to fix and clean those leaves up, or whatever you do um, on that plant. But to me, I think that language will change when our cultural perceptions change, when the root of the problem changes, when we fundamentally see paralysis or blindness differently, when we understand um, that experience differently. I think our language would change. So and that's a really long game way to think about it. And I think that there is something useful about being mindful of language. I'm not saying just ignore it and wait for culture to change and then language will change. I think that there is something a little symbiotic about that. But I think that like if all you're doing is obsessing about language and not addressing the root of it, that's not going to solve very much. But I think as we become more mindful of our language and we address the roots of it, and we kind of do that side by side, I think we can kind of move uh, culturally together. And I think our language will eventually change. I think we've seen that with a few terms already in language over time. And but yeah, I think that you could really drive yourself bananas trying to obsess about language. And I think in writing in particular, I'm very mindful of it. But it's also really deeply embedded in our lexicon, and um, to a point where like when people say lame, I don't think they're thinking about the root of where that word came from and what it originally meant, or any of that. So all that does, I mean, we could talk about that for a while. How do you think about it? How do you think about
I'm
um
I'm struggling with it because
mhm,
I've been academically trained, graduate school, right? I
mhm,
was studying to be a professor, and language is important to me, and the words we use matter.
mhm,
But I think you're right that we should focus on the root cause more, because we can drive ourselves
mhm,
bananas,
mhm,
or we can drive ourselves we can spin in
mhm,
circles
mhm,
if we
mhm,
overanalyze language. So, for example, as somebody who has one arm, right? If
mhm,
somebody says, "I'm going to go wash my hands," is that ableism?
mm. Does
So
it
it
feel like it to you?
no, it never
Yeah,
has.
yeah,
I mean, I say I'm going to go wash my hands just because that's the expression,
yeah. Or
right?
I would
So
say like I walked over there, or like we went for a walk, or
yeah,
like that kind of thing.
yeah,
um which feels a little different than like a slur like lame, right? Like, so I mean, that's when we get into the conversation of language. There's so many different ways that we use these words, and so many um like histories trailing behind them. I think with wash my hands or go for a walk, I don't know if you felt this way before, but like sometimes people, like the thing that makes that an uncomfortable experience is like when people get weird about it, when they're like, No, I mean like roll, or like people just get really like in there and that makes me feel like, oh shoot, like we can relax, it's okay, don't worry about it, I'm fine with you saying go for a walk.
Right.
And I guess maybe that gets to the place where it's like, do we really want to expend our energy worrying about that, or is there other things we could focus on before that? And again, like you said, language matters, the words we use matter, so it's not like we want to just say that it doesn't matter. But there's something in between that feels like it's got to be more effective.
Right. There's always a tipping point where it's just like,
Hmm.
okay, maybe this is a little, we don't need to worry about this. Let's just
Hmm.
bring back some freedom of expression isn't the right word, but let's bring back some, I don't know, some playfulness or some context or some,
Mm.
or let's just focus our energies on tackling the root of the issues,
Mhm.
because then once we do that, if we do that correctly, I feel like new words, new expressions, new
Yeah,
ways of communicating are going to sprout up from that,
yeah,
and then we're going to be enriched by that, rather than, like you said, trying to trim the leaves.
yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I like that idea. That actually makes it kind of exciting to think about, like new expressions. What would that look like? What would that sound like?